My name is Marina Wawamoko, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Churchill Fund, the Center for Sustainability Education, the Department of Environmental Studies, and the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, Shale Gas and Oil Development, Latest Evidence on Leaky Wells, Methane Emissions, and Energy Policy. This event is part of the Clark Forum's Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series. In November 2013, America hit a milestone in energy independence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the U.S. produced more oil domestically than it imported from foreign sources. This recent emphasis on internal sources of energy, although laudable in the prospects of economic growth, has unearthed concerns about the unconventional methods used by some oil and gas extraction enthusiasts. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Anthony Ingraffea, is a leading researcher and important public voice on the oil and gas extraction process, as well as its environmental consequences. Prior to doing research on Dr. Ingraffea, I was vaguely aware of the impact of unconventional extractions of oil and gas, but thanks to Dr. Ingraffea's engagement in the scholarly literature, I know now a lot more than I ever thought I would about methane emissions, greenhouse gas footprints, and wellbore integrity. I'm extremely excited that Dr. Ingraffea is here tonight to share his expertise and enlighten us on this highly debated topic. Dr. Ingraffea is the Dwight C. Baum Professor Emeritus of Engineering and a Vice Presidential Teaching Fellow at Cornell University. In 1994, he won the International Association for Computer Methods and Advances in Geomechanics Award for his research achievements in hydraulic fracturing. In 2006, he won ASTM's George Irwin Medal for Outstanding Research in Fracture Mechanics, and in 2009 was named a Fellow of the International Congress on Fracture. It should then come as no surprise that Time magazine named him one of its people who mattered in 2011. And in the same year, he became the first president of Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy Incorporated. At this time, I would like to ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. A question and answer session will follow the lecture, so please hold your questions until then. To join the conversation on Twitter, use the hashtag IngraffeaTalk. Also, please be sure to drop by the informational tables in the lobby on your way out this evening. The following organizations are represented: the Clean Water Action, Frac Tracker, League of Women Voters, and the Sierra Club. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Ingraffea.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Marina Well, and I'd like to thank the Clark Forum and everybody involved in it for inviting me to be with you here tonight. It's a great honor. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I realize that there is another significant event that you could be watching on TV tonight. I was thinking I should say something hilarious about the conflict, but I figured I better not, except to note in a non-hilarious fashion that all 11 candidates in the debate tonight are pro-shale gas development. I'd also like to point out that so is Hillary Clinton. I'll end with that. But let me begin by saying that everything I talk to you about tonight in terms of data and information is derived directly from peer-reviewed literature and or government reports and or reports issued directly by oil and gas companies. Anything that falls outside of that, I will certainly point out, but of course I will also add my own opinions about how to interpret and use the data and information I'm going to point out to you. So had I been down here 5 years ago, much of the science that is now available would not have been available. It turns out that in 2009, the peer-reviewed literature on shale gas consisted of 6 papers. I'm going to point out to you right now, before getting into the lecture proper, I'm going to the web, And I'm pointing you to a website that I would recommend. It's one that's put together by the organization that Marie Noel mentioned, PSE, Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. We've collected what we think is all of the peer-reviewed literature in the general area of shale and tight gas development. It's publicly available, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and you will see that we now have 612 papers in that literature. So remember, I told you in 2009 there were 6. In 2015 there were 612. One half of that peer-reviewed literature has appeared in the last 18 months. So for those of you who are scholars in this area and want to investigate, I would strongly recommend that you go to this database. It's divided into 12 subcategories. And at the end of my talk, I'll come back and say something more about what you might conclude from reviewing that database. So the first point I want to make is we didn't know very much about shale gas development and its impacts when it got started in Pennsylvania. And I'm sorry to have to say thank you, Pennsylvania, for largely being responsible for much of that literature. But clearly, it began to happen in Pennsylvania before we knew what the impacts were going to be. So with that as an introduction, let me tell you what we're going to do tonight. First, I have to bring everybody up to speed on what I think are the two most important aspects of the development of shale gas and oil that are largely neglected and not talked about as being absolutely fundamental drivers to all of the negative impacts that we're going to talk about tonight. And those are spatial intensity, I'll describe what I mean by that, and technologies of scale. Two absolutely fundamental cardinal characteristics of shale gas development as opposed to conventional gas development or conventional oil development. We'll spend just a brief period of time talking about why those two fundamental aspects are the generators of increased risk and increased impact. We'll then transition to talking about one of those impacts, and that is the impact on private drinking water wells in the state of Pennsylvania. We'll then transition away from that local problem, water well impacts, into the global problem associated with shale gas and oil, and that is its exacerbation of climate change by way of methane emissions. And finally, we'll talk a bit about energy policy, what's happening in Washington with respect to shale gas development, water well contamination, and methane emissions. So that's the game plan, and I'll remind you about the game plan as we transition from one aspect of the talk to another. So we'll begin with spatial intensity and technologies of scale. You've heard probably too many times right now that there's really not much difference between developing a shale gas well in Pennsylvania and any of the 500,000 traditional conventional oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania. And fracking has been around since the late 1940s. What's all the hoopla? Why are we worried about this? Shouldn't we have been worried before? Well, the answer is yes, we should have been worried all the way along, but we should be even more worried now because of spatial intensity and technologies of scale. So, spatial intensity. One image that captures what I mean by spatial intensity, and as I promised, this is an image created by Chesapeake. And I've added some labels to it to help you understand what's going on. So spatial intensity simply means you need a hell of a lot of wells per unit area. And the reason for that, I will try to explain. Here's the bucolic setting in northeastern Pennsylvania. This gray boxy area down here, roughly a mile below the surface, is a shale deposit, a layer of sedimentary rock laid down between 300 and 400 million years ago that is rich in organics, dead animals that have decomposed into everything from methane to oil. Spatial intensity means that since there's gas everywhere in that shale, where would you drill to get it? Everywhere. That's spatial intensity. So that doesn't mean that you're going to drill a well in every square meter on the surface. You don't have to because of modern fracking and drilling technology. You can create pads, areas where you're going to drill, that are roughly a mile apart in one direction and roughly 2 miles apart in another direction. And I'll show you an actual map of Bradford County to show how this actually works out. And from each of those pads, you drill not one well, that would be the traditional conventional approach, but you drill many wells. This particular pictograph shows 6 wells being drilled from each pad. So they start off, as you know, being vertical, and then they deviate. They're directional. That's another enhanced technology developed by the oil and gas industry over the last 30 or 40 years. And so they wind up being lateral, quasi-horizontal. And the idea then is that you have laterals that are separated by roughly 500 feet underground. And half of them are going in one direction, half of them going in the other direction, and now you have accessed a significant amount of the gas in that shale. In fact, you've accessed about 10% of it. I just said things that are contradictory. You've accessed a significant amount of gas. You've accessed about 10% of it. That's the best they can do. With available technology, given all the gas that's in that layer of shale below those 4 pads and those 24 wells, current production activity produces about 10% of what's there. First rhetorical question of the night. What happens to the other 90%? By the way, when I ask a rhetorical question, I expect an answer.
Vent it off into
The
the
other
atmosphere.
90% is lost to our children and grandchildren forever. It's a lost resource. You can't go back a second time. Well, you can go back and refrac the wells, but at $1.70 a thousand, which is the current wellhead price in Pennsylvania, there isn't going to be any refracking anytime soon.
Thank God.
So effectively, this is a high technology, advanced brute force method of getting very little out of the resource. It's highly inefficient. It's the best they can do. And if you're a landowner who has leased their mineral rights, you're getting ripped off. I was going to use another word. But they're only going to be able to get 10% of your resource. It's your gas, and they're going to pay you a royalty on it, and they're only going to get about 10% of it, and they're going to pay you today $1.70, a percentage of $1.70 a thousand. Not smart as a business plan. But that's what I mean by spatial intensity. And there are repercussions to spatial intensity. This is different than the other 500,000 oil and gas wells that were previously drilled in our state. I promised you a map of Bradford County. Here it is. As of April 2013, the colors correspond to different operators. And you'll notice that each of these colors, each of these units is roughly rectangular, not exactly rectangular, it depends upon leasing. And more or less in the center of each of these rectangular units is a black dot, and that's a pad, an area where there are 6, 8, 10, 12 wells. And as you can see, there's a substantial development in Bradford County. And we'll come back to Bradford County again and again over the course of the evening. It's a prototypical Pennsylvania county for shale gas development. But that's spatial intensity. You'd be hard-pressed to find a place in Bradford County where you weren't more than a mile or 2 from a pad, unless you were in a forest someplace. Okay, one of the consequences of spatial intensity is impact on water wells. Most of the people living in Bradford County are not on city water. They're on private water wells. So this is a map that I just found this morning, thanks to Frac Tracker and Public Herald. It shows the various municipalities, the townships in Bradford County, each with a different color. And using color shows the number of complaints from private water well owners to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So you'll notice that many of the municipalities have between 20 and 40 complaints from private water well owners. And again, each one of these dots is a pad, not a well, but a pad. So there are multiple wells in each one of those dots. So a result, a possible result, and in this case a real result of spatial intensity, is an increased risk of an actual occurrence of water well contamination compared to conventional gas development. Because you have so many wells, 1,000 wells, 2,000 wells in Bradford